He just wanted to find water for his dying farm. But what the farmer discovered deep underground shocked everyone and changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The land had once been alive. That was what James Carter reminded himself every morning when he stepped off the porch and walked into the fields, boots sinking into powdery dust where grass used to grow. The air carried no scent of harvest, no sweetness of corn or hay, only the acrid smell of dry soil baking under a merciless sun. The sky stretched pale and empty, a hard shell of heat pressing down on him as if daring him to give up. He moved slowly across the cracked earth, shoulders bent, hat pulled low, the picture of a man who carried not just years but the weight of generations on his back. He remembered the farm as a child. He remembered his father's laughter when the wheat rose higher than a man's waist. Remembered chasing chickens while his mother scolded him. Remembered the way his grandfather, too old to work but still stubborn, would lean on his cane at the edge of the field and say, "This land is ours now. They tried to keep it from us, but we held on. Don't ever let it go." That was before the drought, before his wife's illness, before his sons had looked at the farm and seen not heritage but a prison. Now the place was quiet, almost dead, except for the man who refused to leave it. Inside the barn, Russ spoke louder than life. The old tractor sat hunched like a tired animal, wheels flat, its engine seized years ago. Tools hung on nails, their edges dulled by disuse. He reached out and touched the wooden beam near the door, running his calloused hand over the grooves where his father had carved initials when he was a boy. A lump rose in his throat. He had buried his wife Mary on the small hill behind the house, beneath a cottonwood tree that no longer bloomed. His sons had gone to Dallas and Houston, chasing paychecks and air conditioning, calling once every few months with polite concern that masked their disbelief. They thought he was stubborn, wasting what little life he had left on soil that would never yield again. But the farm was more than land. It was memory, identity, pride. He ate alone at the kitchen table where once there had been laughter, where Mary used to set down cornbread and steaming bowls of beans, where the boys had argued about chores. Now the plates stayed stacked in the cupboard, and he ate from one dish, washing it by hand because there was no reason to dirty another. Nights stretched long and empty, filled only with the creak of the old house and the wind rattling the loose shutters. Sometimes he sat with a photograph of his wife, touching the frame as though warmth could pass through glass and wood. The neighbors had already given up. Driving down the dirt road, he passed sign after sign hammered into the ground. For sale, for auction, land available. Some families left quietly, others left bitterly, cursing the sky as they loaded their belongings into trucks. A few still lingered, clinging to hope, but even they looked at him with a mixture of pity and ridicule. At the feed store in town, men shook their heads and muttered, "Old Carter's still at it. That fool won't quit until the land swallows him whole." Even friends urged him to sell, to walk away while he still had some value to his name. "You're too old for this, James," they said. "Let it go." But James could not. He heard his father's voice too clearly. He saw his grandfather's trembling hands gripping the cane, refusing to bend. He felt the invisible weight of their sacrifice pressing on him each time he looked out over the barren fields. They had survived prejudice, debt, storms, and lean years. Would he be the one to let it all end? The thought made his chest burn with shame. Still, he was tired. Nights found him on the porch with a bottle beside him, watching the stars scatter cold light over a land that should have been green. His body ached, His back stiffened with every dawn, his hands cracked and bled, yet the land held him, pulled him into its silence. He would sit until the moon sank, listening to the insects in the grass and the distant howl of a coyote, asking himself if he had the strength for one more season. It was on such a night that he decided. The picture of his father rested on the table, his stern gaze fixed as if judging him from across time. James remembered his words, spoken decades ago in a voice rough with conviction. "You can lose your house, your money, even your friends, but never give up the land. The land is who we are." He whispered aloud, "I won't let it die." His hands clenched into fists, trembling with both fear and determination. He would drill. He would tear into the earth until it gave him what he needed. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was a waste. But there was no other choice. Without water, the farm was dead. Without the farm, everything his family had endured would be erased. He would find water even if it killed him. At dawn, he rose with new purpose. Dust clung to his boots, sweat stung his eyes, but his movements were sharper, stronger. He drove into town, signing papers he could hardly afford, borrowing money against what little he had left. Men at the counter exchanged looks, whispering when they thought he couldn't hear. "He's going to bankrupt himself. Old man's lost his mind." He ignored them. He had heard it all before. By afternoon, a creaking, rusted drilling rig sat in the yard, its shadow stretching long against the setting sun. He ran his hands along the metal frame, smelling oil and iron, and for the first time in years he felt a spark of hope. Tomorrow he would begin. Tomorrow he would challenge the earth itself. The sun dipped, painting the horizon red, and James stood in silence, staring out over the cracked fields. They looked like scars, deep and unhealed, but he imagined them green again. He imagined his sons returning, children running between rows of corn, laughter echoing across the farm. He imagined life, not death. The dream was fragile, but it was his. Night fell, crickets sang, the wind cooled, and James sat on the porch with Mary's photograph in his hands. "I'll fight for it, love," he murmured, voice breaking. "I'll fight for it until the end." And with that vow, he closed his eyes, knowing the hardest days still lay ahead, but no longer feeling alone. The land was waiting, and so was he. The morning after his vow, James woke before the sun, his body restless with a nervous energy he had not felt in years. The air was cool, but he knew the heat would soon return and press down with the same merciless weight it had carried all summer. He stood by the window, staring out at the drilling rig that loomed against the horizon. It looked both fragile and monstrous, its rusted arms frozen in place like a relic dragged out of another age. It was ugly, noisy, and costly, but to him it had the gleam of salvation. He poured himself a cup of coffee, bitter and strong, and drank it without milk or sugar. The house was silent, the kind of silence that echoes louder than sound, but today it felt less like emptiness and more like preparation. By midday, he had the rig sputtering and groaning into life. The clank of gears, the cough of the old motor, the smell of oil and dust filled the air. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, though the sun had barely climbed. He wiped it away with the back of his sleeve and guided the bit down into the soil. The machine roared, vibrating through his bones, as if the earth itself resisted him. Dust rose in thick clouds, clinging to his clothes, choking his lungs, but he did not stop. With every inch the drill bit dug, he felt a flicker of possibility, the thin hope that somewhere beneath his barren fields, water still flowed. The first day was grueling. The sun climbed high and the heat was a living thing pressing on his shoulders, making his skin burn. He worked alone, stopping only to drink from the canteen, which ran dry too quickly. He thought of his father and grandfather, of the way they had endured storms and droughts, and told himself this was no different. The rig rattled and shook, threatening to break with every turn, but he coaxed it along, muttering encouragement as though it were a stubborn mule. By evening, his arms were heavy, his shirt soaked, and his throat raw from breathing dust. When the motor finally cut, he shut his eyes and let the silence swallow him. Nothing but dry earth had given way. That night, he collapsed onto his bed without undressing. His body throbbed, his back screamed with pain, but sleep would not come easily. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind scraping against the house. Doubt crept into his mind, whispering that the neighbors had been right, that his sons had been right, that he was nothing but an old fool clinging to memories. But then he remembered Mary's smile, the way she used to walk the rows with her basket and talk to the plants as though they could hear her. He remembered his father's stern eyes, the way he had spoken about land as though it were a living member of the family. With those memories, James closed his eyes and forced himself to sleep, whispering, "Tomorrow will be better." The second day brought no relief. The sun blazed hotter, and the ground fought back with a stubbornness that mirrored his own. The drill struck rocks again and again, jarring his arms until he thought his bones would splinter. Dust clogged the machine, and he had to stop more than once to clean it, cursing under his breath. By midday, sweat soaked through his hat, running down his neck in streams. His shirt clung to him like a second skin. His vision swam, and he stumbled once, catching himself against the rig before he fell. For a moment, he thought of quitting, of leaving the machine where it was and walking away. He imagined driving into town, selling what he had left, and letting the land go to auction like so many others. But then he lifted his head and saw the fields stretched out before him, scarred and broken, yet still his. The sight lit a spark in his chest. He thought of his grandfather, who had bought the land when owning anything at all had been a fight, who had endured the sneers and threats of men who said he had no right to it. He thought of the nights his father had worked until dawn to pay off debts, refusing to let the family lose what had cost them so much. He could not be the one to surrender, not him, not now. So he tightened his grip on the rig and pressed forward. Rocks splintered, sparks flew, and the bit ground down further into the stubborn earth. When he finally stopped that evening, he was shaken with exhaustion, his lips cracked and bleeding, his hands blistered raw. He slumped against the rig and closed his eyes, waiting for some sign, some whisper of moisture. But the earth gave him nothing. That night, the doubts returned stronger. He sat at the kitchen table with Mary's photograph propped in front of him. Her eyes seemed to watch him, patient but questioning. He spoke aloud as though she were there. "Am I wasting my life, Mary? Am I chasing a ghost?" His voice cracked, and for a moment he bowed his head, letting the tears fall. But then he straightened, gripping the frame tightly. "No, I can't stop now. If I give up, everything we built dies with me." He set the photo back gently, stood, and walked to the porch. The stars glittered above, cold and indifferent, but he felt a strange kind of calm. Tomorrow would be the third day, and something in him whispered that the third day would matter. The morning came hot and heavy, the air thick as though the earth itself waited. James climbed onto the rig, his body sore but his heart determined. He started the motor, listening to it sputter and roar, and lowered the drill. At first it was the same, hard resistance, the shudder of rock, but then, near midday, the sound changed. It was subtle, almost lost in the noise, but James froze. The drill's rhythm shifted, no longer grinding but echoing, as though the bit had struck a hollow space. His heart leapt into his throat. He pushed further, hands trembling on the controls. Then it happened. The rig groaned, the bit twisted, and from the hole seeped not water but a thick, black substance that clung to the metal. James stared in disbelief, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He dipped his fingers into it, held them up to the light. The liquid glistened dark and sticky with a sharp, heavy smell. His stomach turned. This was not what he wanted. This was not water. He sank onto the ground, staring at the black smear on his skin. Anger rose in him like fire. All the sweat, the pain, the desperate prayers, only to find this? He slammed his fist into the dirt, choking on the bitter taste of disappointment. For a long while he sat there, silent but seething, until the sun began to sink. The rig stood quiet, the hole oozing its strange offering, and James could only think, even the earth is mocking me. When he finally rose and walked back to the house, his steps were heavy, his heart heavier. The dream of water felt shattered, replaced by something he did not understand and did not want. That night, he could not sleep. He lay awake, the smell of oil still clinging to his hands, wondering if the land had given him a curse instead of a blessing. Yet, beneath the anger and despair, another thought stirred, small and insistent. He had dug, and the earth had answered, not with water, but with something. Something he had yet to understand. The smell of the black substance had lingered long after James had washed his hands. It clung to his skin and clothes, sharp and heavy, as though the earth itself had branded him. He woke with it in his nose the next morning, and when he stepped outside, he saw the dark stain around the hole where the rig had stopped. The sun glinted off its slick surface, and the sight filled him with a mixture of dread and confusion. He had asked for water, begged for it in sweat and prayer, and the land had given him this. It looked like a curse, not a blessing, and yet it pulsed with a strange promise, as though whispering that its worth was beyond his understanding. He did not know what to do. He stood at the edge of the rig for a long while, arms folded, squinting at the oozing pit. The soil was wet with something that was not water, thick and glistening, and the drill bit itself was caked in the tar-like residue. His first impulse was to bury it back, to cover the hole and forget the sight. But curiosity gnawed at him. He had lived his whole life on this land and thought he knew every corner of it. How could something so strange lie beneath his feet without him ever knowing? That afternoon, he called a man he knew from town, a geologist who had once surveyed nearby land for a company. The man arrived in a battered truck, carrying his tools and notes, and stepped out with a grin that quickly faded when he saw the rig. He bent low, dipped his fingers into the black substance, rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, then raised his eyebrows. "You've struck oil," he said flatly, as though the words were both obvious and astonishing. James shook his head. "I was looking for water. What use do I have for oil?" The geologist laughed, though it carried little humor. "What use? Man, do you know what this means? You're sitting on money. Real money. This is crude and it's fresh. If the company tests confirm it, you're on top of a reservoir." He launched into explanations about leases, royalties, and drilling rights, but James heard little beyond the first phrase. He had struck oil. The land had not betrayed him, but neither had it answered his prayers. Instead, it had thrown him into a new world he barely understood. When the man left, promising to contact someone from a company he trusted, James sat alone on the porch. The horizon stretched wide and empty, the fields just as cracked and barren as before. Oil could not water his crops. Oil could not fill his canteens or feed his cattle. And yet, he could not dismiss the thought of what it might bring. If the companies were willing to pay for it, perhaps he could buy what the land denied him. He could build wells, irrigation systems, maybe even restore the town that had all but died. The possibility tugged at him like a tide, pulling him between doubt and fragile hope. Within days, the news had spread. In small towns, secrets never lasted, and this was too big to stay hidden. At the feed store, whispers followed him as he walked past. Men slapped him on the shoulder, half congratulating, half mocking. "Old Carter, the oil baron," one said with a laugh. Another muttered, "Bet he sells it all and moves to the city now." A few looked at him with envy sharp enough to cut, their eyes narrowing as though he had stolen something meant for them. James ignored them as best he could, though their voices rang in his ears long after he left. At home, the phone began to ring more often than it had in years. Companies he had never heard of called, offering deals, promising fortunes if he would only sign. Some sent men in pressed suits, their cars raising clouds of dust down his road. They sat in his kitchen, sweating in the heat, spreading contracts across his table, speaking in smooth tones about percentages and guarantees. James listened, his face unreadable, but inside he bristled. He had no interest in chasing wealth for its own sake. He wanted water, life for his land, not luxury he could not use. He sent most of them away with a curt shake of the head. Still, he could not deny that he needed help. He was no oil man, and the thought of trying to control what lay beneath his fields was overwhelming. When the geologist returned with a representative from a small drilling company, their offer was simple. They would handle the extraction. He would receive a share. It was not the grand fortune others had dangled, but it was steady, fair, and, most importantly, free of the false promises that had made him uneasy. After days of thought, he agreed, signing his name with a hand that trembled less from fear than from the weight of decision. The night after signing, James sat again on the porch, the air cooler now that the season had begun to shift. He stared out across the fields, still dry, still silent, and thought about what lay beneath. Oil, hidden for generations, waiting until he, of all people, had driven the drill deep enough to touch it. He wondered if his father or grandfather had ever guessed. Had they walked these same fields, feeling the same despair, never knowing that beneath their feet was something that could change everything? The thought humbled him, but it also stirred a quiet anger. Why had the land denied them, only to yield now when he was nearly at the end of his rope? He wanted water, not this. And yet, he could not shake the idea that perhaps this was the land's way of providing, in its own harsh, roundabout manner. As the days passed, trucks arrived, heavy equipment rumbling across the farm. Workers drove stakes, erected temporary rigs, and tested the flow. James watched them with a wary eye, standing with arms folded as men half his age shouted orders and laughed among themselves. They treated the oil as treasure, but to him it remained a reminder of his failure to find water. And yet, when the first check arrived, modest but more money than he had seen in years, he held it with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. This could buy wells. This could bring back what had been lost. In town, the gossip grew louder. Some insisted he had become rich overnight. He heard it all, but paid little mind. His focus was clear now. He would use whatever came from beneath his land not to chase dreams of wealth, but to restore the farm, to honor the blood and sweat buried in its soil. That night, as he sat alone with Mary's photograph, he whispered, "I didn't find water, but maybe this will lead us to it. Maybe this is how I save what's left." He traced her smile with his finger, then set the picture down carefully. He was still uncertain, still uneasy, but deep in his chest beneath the doubt, a new determination had taken root. The land had given him oil, and he would make it serve the purpose he had sought all along. He would bring water back, even if he had to turn black gold into clear streams. The next morning, when he looked out across the horizon, the fields no longer seemed quite as hopeless. They were still cracked and barren, but for the first time in years he could imagine them alive again. It was not the answer he had prayed for, but it was an answer nonetheless. And James Carter, weary and stubborn, would make it enough. When the first money came in, James held the check in his hands for a long while, studying the numbers as though they were written in some foreign language. He had never been a man of paper wealth. His life had always been measured in bushels of corn, in the weight of cotton harvested, and the number of calves born healthy each spring. To see so much promise captured in a rectangle of ink and paper filled him with a strange mixture of pride and unease. He knew what he had to do with it, and the thought steadied him. This was not for comfort, not for vanity, not for running away from the land as so many expected. This was for water. The very next day he drove into town and signed a contract with a drilling company, not for oil this time, but for wells. He arranged for irrigation pipes, for pumps that could reach deep into the aquifers he still believed lay beneath his farm. The men at the counter raised their eyebrows when he explained what he wanted. Some smirked, no doubt expecting him to spend on a new truck, maybe even a move to the city. James met their gazes with calm resolve and said simply, "I didn't come here to leave this land. I came here to keep it alive." Weeks of work followed. Trucks arrived again, but this time they carried pipes, concrete, and pumps. Men dug and hammered, the sound of industry filling the air, a rhythm of renewal instead of extraction. James walked the fields alongside them, his hat pulled low, pointing out where the old wells had once stood, where his father had drawn water for the cattle, where his mother had filled her buckets at dawn. He remembered carrying that water as a boy, the slosh against the sides of the pail, the way the cold seeped into his arms. Now he was older, slower, but his heart beat faster with the hope that those days might come again. When the first well was capped and the pump installed, James stood with the men as the motor roared to life. For a long moment there was nothing, only the whir of the machine. Then a spurt, weak at first, then stronger, until a stream of clear water shot into the air and cascaded down onto the thirsty soil. The men cheered, but James said nothing. He walked forward, reached his hands into the flow, and let it pour over his cracked skin. The coolness shocked him, filling him with a joy so sharp it bordered on pain. His vision blurred, and he realized his eyes were wet with more than water. Word spread quickly. Neighbors came by to see for themselves. Some offered congratulations. Others asked cautiously if he might share. James looked at their worn faces, at the same desperation that had driven him to gamble everything, and he knew his answer before they spoke. He told them they could bring their tanks and fill them from his well until they had their own. The gratitude in their eyes reminded him of the old days, when neighbors leaned on one another when community meant survival. It felt as if something larger than his farm had been restored. The water brought change almost immediately. James set about laying irrigation lines, watching as the soil darkened and softened under the spray. Grass began to push through in uneven patches, stubborn but alive. The first shoots of green were like flames against the brown dust, fragile and radiant. He walked among them every evening, stooping to touch the blades as if to make sure they were real. The cattle, once gaunt and listless, lifted their heads and moved with new energy when he turned them onto the pasture. They chewed greedily, tails flicking, eyes brighter. Even the birds returned, their calls breaking the silence that had haunted the land for so long. On a day when the pump poured a steady stream into the troughs, James removed his hat and stood beneath the arc of falling water, letting it soak his hair and run down his face. He laughed then, a deep, shaking laugh that rose from his belly and broke into sobs. For the first time in years, the farm felt alive, and with it, so did he. He raised his face to the sky, droplets glittering in the sun, and whispered, "Thank you." The work was far from over. With more checks came more wells, more pipes, more expansion. James did not hoard a cent for himself. He invested it all into the land, into tanks and pumps, into seeds and fertilizer, into restoring the barns and fences. Slowly, acre by acre, the farm began to resemble what it had once been. Fields that had been nothing but cracked dirt sprouted with grass and rows of planted crops. From the road, passers-by could see the change, a patch of green stretching where only desolation had been. And still, James shared. He invited neighbors to use his wells, to draw from his water until their own could be drilled. Some accepted with quiet gratitude, others with embarrassed reluctance, but all left with the weight of hope heavy in their arms. It was more than charity. It was a rebirth of trust, of community. Men who had once mocked him now tipped their hats when they passed. Women brought pies and casseroles as thanks. Children ran through his fields, their laughter a song he thought he would never hear again. The nights felt different, too. Where once James had sat on the porch with only silence and despair for company, now he heard the sound of running water, the lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets stirred by damp soil. The air was cooler, gentler, carrying the scent of grass and growth. He slept better, his dreams no longer haunted by failure, but by visions of harvest. It was not only his farm that began to heal. Word spread to town, and people spoke of James Carter not as the fool who clung to dead land, but as the man who had brought water back. Farmers who had given up began to reconsider. Families who had planned to leave hesitated. The school teacher in town remarked that if the farms revived, perhaps the school might stay open after all. The feed store owner smiled more readily, hopeful that business would grow again. Bit by bit, the pulse of life quickened in a town that had nearly forgotten how to beat. One evening, James walked out to the far edge of his property, where the land dipped toward a dry creek bed. He stood there as the sun sank, watching the shadows stretch long, and thought of all he had endured. He had not struck water with his first desperate dig. He had struck oil, and in that black flow he had found the means to call water back to his land. It was not the gift he had sought, but it had led him to this moment. He thought of his father, his grandfather, and whispered into the cooling air, "I kept it alive. The land's not finished yet." And as the stars brightened overhead, James turned back toward the farmhouse, where lights glowed warmly in the windows and the sound of water echoed steady and sure. For the first time in many years, he believed not just in survival, but in renewal. The land had given back, and he had answered with care. It was only the beginning, but it was enough to make him believe that the farm, and perhaps even the town, still had a future. The weeks of labor and renewal had filled James with a purpose he had thought was long lost. Each morning, when he stepped outside, the farm greeted him with sights and sounds that felt almost miraculous after the years of silence. The grass stretched greener, the cattle moved with new strength, and the steady hum of pumps brought him comfort, reminding him that water now ran through the veins of his land once more. Yet, beneath the joy of recovery, there remained a heaviness, a sense that something deeper lay waiting for him, as though the land had not yet told its whole story. That sense grew stronger when the workers began to carve irrigation channels deeper into the property, widening the veins through which life returned. On a morning heavy with humidity, the men called to him from the far edge of the fields. Their shouts carried urgency, and James hurried across the damp soil, boots sinking slightly into ground that had once been nothing but dust. When he reached them, he saw that their shovels had struck against something hard just below the surface. The foreman explained they had found what seemed to be the remnants of an old well, filled and buried so long ago that no one had remembered it was there. Intrigued, James ordered the digging to continue. Soon, the earth gave way to rotted wood and rusted iron. The workers pried free a broken pulley wheel, then unearthed a length of chain and a bucket whose sides had long since corroded. But beneath these relics, tucked carefully away in the earth, lay a wooden chest, its boards swollen with age yet still intact. James felt his breath catch as they lifted it into the sunlight. The men looked at him, awaiting his word, and he knelt down slowly, brushing dirt from the lid with trembling fingers. The chest bore no lock, only a simple latch, and when he pulled it open, the air that escaped was thick with the musty scent of years gone by. Inside lay items that at first seemed ordinary: tools with handles worn smooth, a pair of boots cracked and stiff, and a folded shirt yellowed with time. But beneath these objects lay a stack of photographs, curled at the edges, and a journal bound in weathered leather. James lifted the photographs carefully, as though they might crumble in his hands. He saw faces, both familiar and strange. His father as a boy, grinning in front of a mule-drawn plow, his grandfather standing proud though weary, a woman at his side who could only have been James's grandmother. There were scenes of the farm in its youth, the fields stretching wide with crops, the house newly built, the barn in its first coat of paint. Each picture was a fragment of a history he had known only in stories, now made real before his eyes. His hands shook as he opened the journal. The handwriting was rough but steady, the ink faded yet legible. It was his grandfather's. The entries told of days of toil and nights of worry, of the struggle to make the land theirs in the face of prejudice and hardship. He wrote of debts barely paid, of storms that had flattened crops, of the fear that the land might be taken from them by those who believed they had no right to it. But there were also words of pride, of determination. Again and again, one theme returned. The land must remain in the family, no matter the cost. If the soil is dry, you must wait for rain. If the harvest is poor, you must plant again. But do not sell. Do not surrender. This land is our legacy, and it will keep us alive as long as we honor it. James read deep into the night, unable to stop, his lantern casting long shadows across the kitchen walls. He felt his grandfather's presence in every word, as though the old man were sitting across from him, speaking directly into his heart. He saw himself in the struggles described, the endless fight against forces larger than any one man. He realized that his recent battle with drought, his despair, his refusal to give up, were not new trials, but the continuation of a long thread that bound him to those who came before. He was not alone in his stubbornness. He was carrying a torch handed down through generations. When he closed the journal, his cheeks were wet with tears he had not noticed falling. He sat in silence for a long while, the chest open beside him, the photographs spread across the table. In the quiet, he imagined his father's voice, stern yet full of pride, and his grandfather's voice, rough but unyielding. He whispered into the stillness, "I hear you. I won't fail you." The weight he had carried for so long felt different now, less like a burden and more like a mantle. The following morning, he carried the chest out to the porch. He set the photographs carefully on a table where the sunlight struck them, studying each face with reverence. The workers who passed gave curious glances, but he paid them no mind. He wanted the land itself to see what had been hidden within it all these years. He wanted the earth to remember the hands that had tilled it, the voices that had prayed over it, the sweat that had soaked into its soil. As the days passed, James found himself turning to the journal often, reading passages before bed, sometimes aloud, as though speaking them into the walls of the farmhouse might fortify its timbers. The words steadied him, reminding him why he fought, why he sacrificed, why he would never abandon the land. It was not just about crops or cattle, not just about survival. It was about family. It was about honoring those who had endured so that he could stand where he stood now. The chest and its contents became a kind of shrine. When neighbors came to thank him for water, he would show them the photographs, telling stories of his grandfather's battles, of his father's determination. Some listened with quiet respect, others with tears in their eyes. The history of his family became, in a way, the story of the town itself, a reminder that endurance was not only possible, but necessary. One night, as rain pattered gently on the roof, James sat at the table with the journal open before him. He traced the lines of a final entry written in shaky script, his grandfather's last words on the page. "The land will test you, but it will also hold you. Do not let it go." James closed the book slowly, his heart full. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the fields dark with new life. The pumps hummed in the distance, steady and sure, like the beating of a heart. He thought of how far they had come, of how close he had come to giving up, and he knew that finding oil had not been chance alone. The land had given him a way to fulfill the promise carved into his blood. Standing there, he felt no loneliness, no despair. He felt the presence of those who had come before, their strength flowing through him. The farm was alive again, and so was he. The legacy was not just memory now, it was living proof that perseverance could wrest life from even the harshest soil. And James Carter, weathered but unbroken, swore once more that he would carry it forward as long as he drew breath. The discovery of the chest and the words of his grandfather settled into James's heart like a steady flame, and it burned brighter each day he rose to work the fields. The farm no longer felt like a solitary battle. It felt like a promise fulfilled, a hand extended across time. Yet James understood that the story did not end at the boundary of his property. The land was alive again, but the town around him still carried the weight of loss. The schoolhouse that had once rung with laughter had been shuttered, weeds curling up the steps. The market stood half empty, shelves gathering dust. Families who had fled during the long years of drought had not yet returned. James could not forget the looks of his neighbors when they came for water. Grateful, yes, but also weary, as though afraid to hope too much. He knew then that his fight was no longer only for himself. With the next check from the oil company, he did not hesitate. He called the workers back, not to dig deeper on his own farm, but to help lay pipes that would stretch toward neighboring properties. When the men asked why he would spend his own money to bring water to others, James only answered, "Because what good is saving one farm if the rest dies around it?" He had lived long enough to understand that a man could not thrive in isolation. A farm needed a town as much as a town needed its farms. Without the balance, everything withered. So the work began anew. Pipes snaked across the dry fields, carried on the backs of trucks, welded and buried by sweating men under the blazing sun. James supervised every step, his presence a constant reminder that this was not charity but community. He was often seen lifting pipes alongside the younger men, his shirt soaked through, his hands black with grease. When the first streams of water reached a neighbor's land, the sight brought tears to eyes hardened by years of struggle. The soil darkened, grass appeared, and children laughed as they splashed their hands in the troughs. For the first time in memory, hope seemed contagious. The change was not only in the soil, but in the faces of the people. Where once men had passed James with skeptical smirks or wary silence, now they tipped their hats, called his name with warmth, even stopped to shake his hand. Women arrived at his porch carrying pies, jars of preserves, baskets of fresh bread. Children began to treat his farm as a place of gathering, their laughter echoing across the fields in the afternoons. It startled him at first, this flood of life into a place that had been silent so long. He would sit on the porch in the evenings, hearing voices and laughter drifting across the land, and feel something loosen inside him, a knot he had not known was so tight. The town began to stir with a vitality it had not known in years. The market reopened with new produce, small at first but growing steadily. Trucks arrived with supplies not seen in a long while, and shopkeepers greeted customers with genuine smiles. The feed store, which had once looked ready to shutter, now bustled with orders. The school board met again, debating whether the classrooms could be reopened with enough children returning. Teachers spoke of hope, of books and lessons filling the rooms once more. For James, each of these small changes was proof that he had been right not to abandon his land. The oil beneath his feet had not brought him wealth alone. It had given him the means to heal a community. He never forgot his purpose. Every dollar that came from the wells was turned outward into water systems, seeds, repairs. He rebuilt fences not only for his cattle, but for his neighbors' herds. He donated lumber to repair the sagging roof of the church. He helped purchase new desks for the schoolhouse. People called him generous, even saintly, but James brushed off the praise. In his mind, he was only doing what the journal in that chest had commanded, to keep the land, to hold it, to never let it go. For him, that meant ensuring it was alive not only for himself, but for those who shared it. Yet, despite the progress, James carried himself with humility. He still drove the same battered truck, wore the same worn boots. He ate simply at the kitchen table, just as he always had, though sometimes now he had company, a neighbor dropping by with gratitude, a friend sharing coffee and talk of crops. His evenings were no longer consumed by silence, but by conversation, the rhythm of community restored. One summer evening, the town gathered for the first harvest festival they had dared to hold in years. Long tables were set in the square, covered with dishes brought by every family. Lanterns swung from posts, and music floated into the night. Children ran between the tables, their laughter mixing with the sounds of fiddles and guitars. James sat quietly at the edge at first, content to watch, but as people came to him, Clasping his hands, thanking him, urging him to sit among them, he allowed himself to join. He listened to their stories, their plans, their dreams, and he felt a swelling in his chest, not pride in what he had done, but gratitude that the land had not been lost. At one point during the evening, the mayor, a man who had once scoffed at him for refusing to sell, stood and raised a glass. He spoke of resilience, of how one man's stubbornness had rekindled the spirit of the town. He called James a symbol of what it meant to endure. The crowd erupted in applause, and though James lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the attention, a smile tugged at his lips. He thought of Mary, of how she would have loved to see this night, to hear the music and laughter, to taste the food of neighbors bound together. Later, when the festival quieted and families drifted home, James lingered in the square. He looked at the storefronts, once abandoned and now lit with lamps, and at the schoolhouse where repairs were already underway. He listened to the murmur of voices fading into the distance and thought of the journal in his home, of the words written by a man who had believed the land would test them but also hold them. His grandfather had been right. The land had tested him nearly to the breaking point, but it had held him too, and now it was holding all of them. When he returned to the farm that night, he walked the fields slowly, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the dark. The pumps hummed steadily in the distance, and the cattle shifted in the pasture. He tipped his head back, gazing at the stars, and whispered a simple promise. As long as I breathe, this land will never be alone again. It was not only his farm anymore, it was the heart of a town, and he was its keeper. The oil still flowed, the checks would still come, but to James those things were only means, never ends. What mattered was the green rising from the soil, the children laughing in the fields, the neighbors standing together again. The town was alive, and in its heartbeat he heard the echo of his own family, of his grandfather's voice, of the vow he had carried across decades. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt not only hope, but peace. The festival lingered in James's memory for days afterward. He could still hear the music when he sat quietly on his porch, the sound of fiddles and laughter drifting back to him like a dream. The sight of neighbors smiling, of children chasing one another through the fields, remained vivid in his mind, a reminder of how far they had all come from the silence and despair of the drought years. Yet, as much as he cherished these changes, James felt the weight of time settling on his shoulders. He had fought hard to bring life back, but he knew he would not be the one to carry it forever. The land had to pass on, just as it had come to him from his father and his father before that. In the mornings, he walked the farm more slowly now. His knees ached and his breath sometimes came short, but he moved with the dignity of a man who had made peace with the years. He paused often, leaning on his cane where once he had leaned on a plow, gazing out over fields that rippled green under the wind. He thought of Mary as he did so, of how she had walked these rows with her basket, how her laughter had lifted him on days when he thought he could not endure another hour of labor. He imagined her still there, a shadow beside him, and though it brought sorrow, it also steadied him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with fire, a truck rolled up the drive. James recognized the sound of the engine even before he saw it. His son, Samuel, stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair flecked with gray that surprised James when the light caught it. Samuel had not been back for more than a handful of visits since leaving for the city years ago. For a moment, father and son stood in silence, measuring the distance time had put between them. Then Samuel approached slowly, his expression uncertain. "I heard about the festival," Samuel said, his voice carrying both pride and guilt. "They say you saved the town." James smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I didn't save it. The land did. I just gave it a chance to breathe again." They walked the fields together, the father slower, the son matching his pace without complaint. James showed him the new irrigation lines, the restored barns, the cattle grazing on pastures that had once been dust. He spoke of the market reopening, of the school preparing for children again. Samuel listened in silence, his eyes roaming the horizon, the weight of what he saw settling into him. That night, over a simple meal at the kitchen table, Samuel finally spoke the words James had longed to hear. "I was wrong to leave you with this burden. I thought the farm was dying, that it had no place in the future. But you proved me wrong. You were right to hold on." His voice caught, and he looked down, ashamed. "I should have been here." James reached across the table, laying his rough hand over his son's. "You did what you thought you had to. The city gave you opportunities this land couldn't, but it's not too late. The farm's alive again. It will need hands long after mine are gone." The silence that followed was thick, filled with all the years they had lost, but it was not hopeless. Samuel's hand tightened over his father's, and in that gesture James felt the chain of generations knit itself together again. Days turned into weeks, and Samuel stayed. He rose early to help with the chores, his city hands clumsy at first but growing surer with each passing day. Neighbors remarked on his return, nodding in approval as though the land itself had willed him back. For James, it was like seeing the farm reborn twice over, once in the soil and now in his bloodline. He knew then that his work had meaning beyond what he had already achieved. The land was not only surviving, it was preparing to outlast him. One late afternoon, James sat on the porch with the chest of family relics open beside him. The photographs of his father and grandfather lay spread across the table, the journal resting on top. Samuel joined him, leaning over to study the images, to read the words written in faded ink. James told him the stories he had grown up with, the struggles, the victories, the vow to never surrender the land. Samuel listened intently, his expression solemn, as though absorbing not just history but duty. At last he said quietly, "This isn't just your legacy. It's mine, too. I want to keep it." A quiet peace filled James's heart. He had feared the land would die with him, that all he had fought for would end when his strength did. Now he saw that the legacy had taken root again, not only in the soil, but in his son's heart. The town continued to thrive. The market bustled with produce, the school reopened its doors, and the church bells rang with new vigor. Families who had left began to return, drawn by the promise of renewal. At the center of it all stood the Carter farm, once nearly lost, now a beacon of endurance. People came not just for water or work, but for the reminder that despair could be overcome, that even the harshest land could bloom again with patience and faith. On the final evening of summer, James sat alone on the porch, the chest closed and resting by his feet. He gazed out at the fields, green and strong, cattle grazing lazily under the fading light. The pumps hummed in the distance, steady as a heartbeat, and the voices of children carried across the air, rising from the town that had been reborn. Samuel was out in the pasture, finishing chores, and the sight of him moving among the cattle filled James with pride. He took up the photograph of his grandfather, running his thumb along the edge. "I kept it," he whispered. "I didn't let it go." He felt the presence of those who had come before him in the rustle of the leaves, in the whisper of the wind through the grass, in the cool touch of the evening air. He was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. The land was alive, the family was whole, and the promise had been kept. As the last light faded and the stars appeared, James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He could hear the laughter of children, the murmur of voices, the steady rhythm of water flowing through pipes and streams. It was the sound of life, the sound of endurance, the sound of a legacy secured. And with a smile, he let the night embrace him, knowing that the land would live on, cared for by those who carried his blood, strengthened by the promise that had guided him all his days. Don't leave just yet. There are even more unbelievable stories waiting for you. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss what happens next. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends. Let them see how one man's fight changed everything. Click on the next video on your screen, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming.